The sound of shattering glass echoed through the hallway of Jefferson High School as 17-year-old Marcus Thompson watched his grandfather's vintage calculator, a gift from his deceased veteran grandfather, get smashed against the lockers by Derek Walsh, the school's most notorious bully. What Derek didn't know was that the quiet substitute teacher who had just rounded the corner, carrying a stack of worn textbooks and wearing a simple button-down shirt, was former Marine, Staff Sergeant James Rivera. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And what none of them could have imagined was that this seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning would become the day that changed everything at Jefferson High forever. The autumn rain drummed steadily against the windows of Jefferson High School as James Rivera pulled his modest Honda Civic into the faculty parking lot at precisely 7:30 in the morning. The vehicle looked unremarkable among the mix of teacher cars and administrative SUVs, its faded blue paint and minor door dings telling the story of practical transportation rather than status display. James sat for a moment in the driver's seat, studying the imposing brick facade of the school building through rain-streaked windshield, his weathered hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. At 34 years old, James carried himself with a quiet composure that most people mistook for shyness or uncertainty. His medium build, an unassuming appearance, brown hair kept neat but not military precise, simple khaki pants and a pressed white shirt, suggested nothing more than another substitute teacher trying to make ends meet between permanent positions. The only hints of his military background were subtle. The way he automatically scanned his surroundings upon exiting the vehicle, the precise economy of his movements as he gathered his materials, and the small Marine Corps pin he wore discreetly on his collar, so small that few people ever noticed it. James had been substituting at various schools throughout the district for the past 8 months, maintaining the deliberately low profile that had become second nature during his transition from military to civilian life. His substitute teaching assignments provided steady income while he completed his education degree. But more importantly, they allowed him to remain largely invisible, avoiding the questions and assumptions that often followed when people learned about his military service. The morning briefing in the main office was conducted by Principal Patricia Donovan, a well-intentioned administrator whose genuine concern for student welfare was consistently undermined by the bureaucratic constraints and political pressures that defined modern public education. She reviewed James's assignment with professional efficiency, though her slightly apologetic tone suggested she was aware of the challenges he might face. "You'll be covering Mrs. Henderson's American history classes today," she explained, sliding a manila folder across her desk. "She's dealing with a family emergency, so we don't have much advance notice. The lesson plans are straightforward. Continuing their unit on World War II. Shouldn't be too complicated." James nodded politely, accepting the folder and scanning its contents with the methodical attention to detail that military service had ingrained in him. The lesson plans were indeed straightforward, focusing on the Pacific Theater and the island hopping campaign that had characterized American strategy against Japanese forces. He noted the irony that he would be teaching about events he had studied extensively during his own military education, though from a perspective shaped by actual combat experience in more recent conflicts. "The students are generally well-behaved," Principal Donovan continued, though something in her expression suggested this assessment required qualification. "We do have a few individuals who can be challenging, particularly in the afternoon classes. If you experience any significant issues, don't hesitate to contact the office immediately." Her euphemistic description of challenging individuals was standard administrative language that James had encountered at other schools. Every educational institution had its population of students who pushed boundaries, tested authority, and created disruption through various means. What varied was the school's willingness and ability to address such behavior effectively, and James had already observed enough during his brief time in the building to suspect that Jefferson High's approach leaned heavily toward accommodation rather than accountability. The morning classes proceeded smoothly, with James maintaining the quiet, respectful demeanor that had served him well in previous substitute assignments. He delivered the planned lessons competently, answered student questions thoughtfully, and managed classroom dynamics with gentle authority that encouraged participation without inviting chaos. The students seemed to appreciate his straightforward approach and lack of condescension, responding with the kind of cautious cooperation that marked successful substitute teaching experiences. During his lunch break, James sat alone in the faculty lounge, reviewing the afternoon lesson plans while eating a simple sandwich he had packed from home. The space buzzed with the casual conversation of permanent teachers discussing student issues, administrative policies, and the various challenges that defined their daily professional lives. James listened without participating, gathering information about the school's culture and dynamics through careful observation rather than direct inquiry. "The Walsh boy is getting worse," commented Sandra Martinez, a veteran English teacher whose frustration was evident in her voice. "Yesterday, he completely disrupted my fourth period class, and when I tried to address it, he just laughed and walked out. Administration won't do anything meaningful because his father sits on the school board." Her colleague, Robert Chen, nodded with resignation. "Same pattern every year. Derek and his group get progressively more brazen as the semester advances, and we're expected to just manage it somehow. The other students suffer, but heaven forbid we actually hold anyone accountable." James noted this information without comment, filing it away as potentially relevant context for his afternoon classes. The dynamic they described was familiar from other schools he had worked in, situations where influential families received differential treatment, creating environments where certain students operated with effective impunity while others faced consequences for identical behavior. The conversation continued with additional details about Derek Walsh and his associated group of students who had established themselves as the unofficial power structure within the school's social hierarchy. They were described as intelligent, enough to avoid the most serious infractions that would force administrative action, but consistently disruptive in ways that undermined the educational environment for everyone else. Their behavior included verbal intimidation of other students, deliberate disruption of classes, and the kind of psychological bullying that left no physical evidence but created lasting emotional damage. "It's not just Derek," added Martinez. "He's got Jason Kruger and Tyler Stone following his lead, plus a few others who rotate in and out depending on the situation. They've turned intimidation into an art form, and most of the other students are too afraid to report anything." The picture that emerged was of a carefully maintained system of dominance, built on fear and enabled by administrative reluctance to confront influential families. James recognized the dynamics from his military experience, where similar patterns could develop when leadership failed to maintain consistent standards of accountability. The difference was that in military contexts, such failures typically resulted in rapid corrective action once identified, whereas educational institutions often lacked the authority or political support necessary for meaningful intervention. As the lunch period concluded, James gathered his materials and prepared for the afternoon classes that would include the individuals his colleagues had discussed. His approach would remain consistent with his established pattern: quiet competence, respectful authority, and careful observation of student behavior and group dynamics. He had no intention of seeking confrontation, but neither would he allow disruption to compromise the educational environment for students who were genuinely trying to learn. The first afternoon class proceeded without significant incident, though James noted the presence of Jason Kruger, a lanky teenager whose carefully cultivated appearance of disinterest masked constant surveillance of his surroundings. Jason sat in the back corner of the classroom, contributing nothing to discussions, but clearly cataloging every interaction for later analysis and potential exploitation. His behavior was subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation, but persistent enough to create an undercurrent of tension that affected other students' willingness to participate actively. James adapted his teaching approach slightly, maintaining engagement through direct questions and structured activities that minimized opportunities for disruption, while ensuring that learning objectives were met. He noted which students seemed most affected by the intimidating presence, making mental adjustments to provide additional support and encouragement where needed. The real test would come during fifth period, when Derek Walsh himself would be present along with what his colleagues had described as his core group of followers. James approached this class with the same calm preparation he had once brought to significantly more dangerous situations, understanding that the principles of situational awareness and measured response applied equally whether facing hostile forces overseas or disruptive teenagers in American classrooms. When fifth period began, Derek Walsh entered the classroom with the swagger of someone accustomed to being the center of attention and getting his way through intimidation rather than merit. At 17, he had already developed the calculated arrogance that marked certain types of bullies, intelligent enough to identify vulnerabilities in others, manipulative enough to exploit institutional weaknesses, and socially connected enough to escape meaningful consequences for his actions. Derek was accompanied by Tyler Stone, a powerfully built teenager whose role seemed primarily physical intimidation, and Marcus Thompson, a smaller student whose presence in the group puzzled James until he observed the dynamic more carefully. Marcus appeared uncomfortable with the association, but trapped by circumstances that weren't immediately apparent. His body language suggested reluctance rather than enthusiasm for the group's activities, though he made no overt attempts to distance himself from them. James began the lesson as planned, introducing the day's topic with the same straightforward approach he had used successfully in earlier classes. For the first 15 minutes, the classroom dynamic remained manageable, with Derek and his associates maintaining their typical pattern of disengagement without active disruption. James continued teaching, aware of their presence, but not allowing it to alter his professional demeanor or compromise his delivery of the educational content. The shift began subtly, with Derek making quiet comments to Tyler that were clearly intended to be heard by nearby students, while remaining just below the threshold that would require direct intervention. The comments were carefully crafted to undermine James's authority, without providing clear grounds for disciplinary action. Questions about his qualifications, speculation about his background, and suggestions that substitute teachers weren't worth taking seriously. James recognized the strategy immediately. It was a testing phase designed to probe for weakness and establish dominance through incremental escalation. His response was measured and professional, continuing to deliver the lesson while making mental notes about the specific tactics being employed and the reactions of other students to the developing situation. "Mr. Rivera," Derek said, raising his hand with exaggerated formality, "I'm curious about your background. Have you actually served in the military yourself, or are you just reading from the textbook like most substitute teachers?" The question was designed to create a no-win situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Admitting military service would invite further probing and potential mockery, while denying it would undermine credibility when teaching military history. James recognized the trap and chose a response that neither confirmed nor denied the implication, while redirecting focus to the educational content. That's an excellent question about the importance of primary sources in historical education, he replied calmly. The experiences of veterans who served in these conflicts provide invaluable perspective on the events we're studying. What aspects of the Pacific Campaign do you think would be most challenging for someone who wasn't there to understand fully? Derek's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing that his attempt at manipulation had been deflected skillfully. Rather than escalating immediately, he chose to continue the testing process through different means, making comments designed to gauge James's tolerance for disruption and his willingness to enforce classroom expectations. Tyler Stone contributed to the effort through non-verbal intimidation, shifting in his seat, making deliberate noise with his materials, and engaging in whispered conversations that drew attention away from the lesson without providing clear grounds for intervention. The combination of verbal probing and behavioral disruption created an environment where other students became increasingly uncomfortable, though none were willing to openly address the situation. James continued teaching, adapting his approach to maintain engagement despite the ongoing interference. He used movement around the classroom to manage proximity dynamics, employed direct questions to keep focus on educational content, and maintained the calm authority that refused to be drawn into confrontation while making it clear that disruptive behavior was noted and would not be tolerated indefinitely. The escalation continued throughout the class period, with Derek and his associates pushing boundaries incrementally while carefully avoiding actions that would force immediate consequences. Their strategy relied on creating cumulative pressure, rather than dramatic incidents, understanding that administrators were more likely to excuse isolated disruptions than address patterns of behavior that required sustained attention and political courage. As the class period neared its end, Derek made his move for a more direct challenge. Standing from his desk with deliberate casualness, he approached James's desk while other students were working on an assigned reading exercise. His movement was calculated to appear innocent while positioning him for maximum psychological impact. "You know, Mr. Rivera," Derek said in a voice loud enough for the entire class to hear, "I've been thinking about what my father always says about people who end up as substitute teachers. He says it's usually because they couldn't succeed at anything else. What do you think about that?" The comment was designed to provoke an emotional response that would either reveal weakness or create grounds for Derek to claim he was being treated unfairly by an authority figure who couldn't control his temper. James recognized the manipulation, immediately drawing on years of experience, dealing with significantly more dangerous attempts at psychological warfare in military contexts. "I think your father raises an interesting point about career paths and the various factors that influence people's professional choices," James replied with unruffled calm. "What factors do you think are most important when evaluating someone's success and contribution to society?" Once again, Derek's attempt at provocation had been deflected through a response that maintained dignity while redirecting the conversation toward productive, educational discussion. His frustration was becoming visible, though he maintained enough self-control to avoid crossing lines that would force immediate administrative intervention. The bell-ending fifth period provided a natural conclusion to the developing confrontation, with students gathering their materials and preparing to leave for their next classes. Derek and his associates made their exit with exaggerated casualness, clearly communicating that they considered the interaction unfinished business rather than a concluded encounter. James remained at his desk as students filed out, maintaining His composed demeanor while processing the dynamics he had observed and the likely continuation of the testing process in future interactions. He understood that Derek's group would interpret his measured responses as either weakness to be exploited or strength to be challenged more directly, depending on their assessment of the risk-reward calculation involved. Marcus Thompson lingered briefly near the door, glancing back toward James, with an expression that suggested internal conflict about something he wanted to say but couldn't bring himself to articulate. The moment passed quickly as Tyler Stone called to him from the hallway, and Marcus hurried to rejoin the group without making the comment that had clearly been on his mind. As the classroom emptied, James gathered his materials and prepared for his final class of the day, understanding that the events of fifth period had established a dynamic that would likely continue and escalate in future encounters. His approach would remain consistent: professional competence, measured responses, and careful documentation of behavior patterns that might eventually require administrative intervention. What James couldn't have anticipated was that Derek Walsh's frustration with his inability to provoke the desired reaction would lead to a significant escalation in tactics, and that this escalation would ultimately reveal capabilities and background, information that would transform the entire dynamic at Jefferson High School in ways that no one could have predicted. The sixth period class proceeded without the presence of Derek's core group, allowing James to deliver the lesson plan as intended while observing the behavior of students who weren't operating under the intimidating influence of the school's unofficial power structure. The difference was remarkable: increased participation, more thoughtful questions, and a general atmosphere of engagement that highlighted how significantly the bullying dynamic affected the entire educational environment. During the class, James noticed several students who had been present during fifth period but had remained silent throughout Derek's testing behavior. Now freed from that intimidating presence, they participated actively in discussions and demonstrated genuine interest in the historical content being covered. Their transformation reinforced his understanding of how thoroughly fear-based social hierarchies could suppress normal educational interaction. Sarah Chen, a quiet sophomore who had sat motionless during the earlier confrontation, raised her hand to ask a thoughtful question about the strategic decisions that had shaped the Pacific campaign. Her question demonstrated both knowledge of the material and analytical thinking skills that had been completely invisible when Derek's group was present. James made a mental note about the stark contrast, recognizing it as evidence of the broader impact that effective bullying could have on academic achievement and student development. After the final bell, James remained in the classroom to complete his daily documentation and prepare materials for Mrs. Henderson's return the following day. The process gave him time to reflect on the day's events and consider appropriate responses to the developing situation with Derek Walsh and his associates. His military training had taught him the importance of accurate assessment and measured response, understanding that both overreaction and underreaction could lead to escalation of conflicts that might otherwise be managed effectively. The challenge lay in navigating the complex dynamics of educational politics, where direct confrontation could be interpreted as unprofessional behavior by a substitute teacher who was expected to maintain order without creating waves that might reflect poorly on the administration's management of student behavior. James understood that his temporary status in the school limited his options for addressing systemic issues, but it didn't eliminate his responsibility to protect students who were being intimidated and to maintain educational standards in his classroom. As he prepared to leave for the day, James encountered Principal Donovan in the hallway outside his classroom. Her expression suggested she had received reports about the fifth period class, though whether from students, other teachers, or administrative monitoring wasn't immediately clear. "How did your first day go, Mr. Rivera?" she asked with the carefully neutral tone administrators used when they suspected problems but hadn't determined the appropriate response. "Any issues I should be aware of?" James considered his response, carefully understanding that his assessment of Derek Walsh's behavior would need to be factual and professional, while avoiding accusations that might create political complications for the principal. His military experience had taught him the value of documentation and measured communication when dealing with potentially volatile situations. "The classes went well overall," he replied honestly. "Students seemed engaged with the material, and most participated actively in discussions. I did notice some testing behavior from a few individuals in fifth period, but nothing that disrupted the learning environment significantly. The lesson objectives were met successfully." Principal Donovan nodded, though her expression suggested she was reading between the lines of his diplomatic summary. "Derek Walsh was in that class, wasn't he?" she asked, confirming that she was already aware of the likely source of any reported issues. "Yes, along with several other students whose names I haven't memorized yet," James replied, maintaining the neutral tone that avoided singling out specific individuals while acknowledging the principal's obvious concern. "Is there particular context about that class that would be helpful for me to understand?" The question put the principal in the position of either providing useful information about known behavioral issues or maintaining the administrative fiction that all students were treated equally regardless of their family connections or past behavior. Her hesitation suggested internal conflict between professional responsibility and political considerations. "Derek can be challenging," she admitted, finally choosing her words carefully. "He's very intelligent, but sometimes uses that intelligence in ways that create difficulties. If you experience any significant problems, please contact the office immediately. We want to support our substitute teachers effectively." James nodded politely, understanding that he had received as much useful information as the principal was willing or able to provide. The conversation concluded with professional courtesies, but he left the building with a clear understanding that Derek Walsh's behavior was a known issue that the administration preferred to manage through careful handling rather than direct confrontation. The drive home provided time for reflection on the day's events and consideration of strategies for future interactions with Derek's group. James's military experience had taught him that understanding your opponent's motivations and capabilities was essential for developing effective responses, and he had gathered significant information about the dynamics at play in Jefferson High School's social structure. Derek Walsh represented a particular type of adversary, intelligent enough to understand systems and exploit weaknesses, manipulative enough to avoid clear accountability for his actions, and protected enough by family influence to operate with reduced fear of consequences. His testing behavior suggested both narcissistic tendencies and strategic thinking, making him potentially dangerous to students who lacked the social or emotional resources to resist his intimidation tactics. The enabling environment at Jefferson High appeared to result from a combination of administrative conflict avoidance, political pressure from influential families, and institutional culture that prioritized avoiding problems over solving them. This created conditions where Derek's behavior could flourish while victims remained isolated and without effective recourse for addressing their treatment. James's own position as a substitute teacher provided both advantages and limitations in dealing with this situation. His temporary status meant he had less to lose from confrontation with protected students, but it also meant his ability to implement lasting changes was severely limited. His military background provided skills and perspectives that could be valuable in managing conflict, but it also created potential for misunderstanding if his responses were perceived as disproportionate. To the civilian educational context, at his modest apartment that evening, James prepared for the possibility that his encounter with Derek Walsh was far from concluded. His research into effective strategies for dealing with institutional bullying confirmed that such behavior typically escalated when initial testing failed to produce desired results. Derek's frustration with his inability to provoke James during fifth period suggested that future encounters would likely involve more direct challenges requiring clearer responses. James spent time reviewing educational best practices for classroom management and conflict resolution, understanding that his military experience needed to be balanced with appropriate civilian approaches to student behavior. His goal remained consistent with his professional responsibilities, maintaining a productive learning environment while protecting students from intimidation and ensuring that educational objectives were met regardless of social dynamics. What he couldn't anticipate was that Derek Walsh's next attempt to establish dominance would target one of the school's most vulnerable students in a way that would force James to choose between maintaining his carefully constructed low profile and intervening to prevent serious harm. That choice, when it came, would reveal capabilities and background that would fundamentally alter the balance of power at Jefferson High School and expose the true cost of institutional failure to address bullying effectively. The following morning brought crisp autumn air and the promise of continued challenges as James returned to Jefferson High School for his second day of substituting for Mrs. Henderson. His routine remained unchanged: early arrival, professional preparation, and careful observation of the school environment for any shifts in dynamics that might affect his effectiveness in the classroom. During the morning briefing, Principal Donovan mentioned that she had received positive feedback about his teaching from several students, though she also noted that there had been some concerns raised about his interaction with certain individuals. The euphemistic language confirmed that Derek Walsh or his associates had likely complained about James's refusal to be intimidated, though the principal's tone suggested she was taking such complaints with appropriate skepticism. "Just continue doing what you're doing," she advised. "But please keep me informed if any situations develop that require administrative attention. We want to support both our substitute teachers and our students effectively." The morning classes proceeded smoothly, with James continuing to build rapport with students who appreciated his straightforward teaching style and respectful classroom management. He noted increased participation from several students who had seemed withdrawn the previous day, suggesting that word was spreading about his ability to maintain order without creating an oppressive atmosphere. During lunch, James overheard additional conversation among faculty members about the ongoing challenges with Derek Walsh's behavior. The discussion revealed that several teachers had requested administrative support in dealing with his increasingly brazen disruptions, but that such requests had been met with suggestions for classroom management strategies rather than direct intervention. "It's getting worse each week," commented Martinez, the English teacher who had mentioned Derek previously. "Yesterday, he reduced Jenny Morrison to tears in my class, and when I tried to address it, he claimed he was just asking academic questions. Administration says we need to document everything before they can take action, but by the time we have enough documentation, the semester will be over." The pattern was familiar to James from other institutions where leadership preferred to manage problems through procedural requirements rather than decisive action. The documentation demands served multiple purposes. They created delays that often allowed problems to resolve themselves through graduation or transfer. They established bureaucratic cover for administrators who could claim they were following proper procedures, and they shifted responsibility for addressing problems from leadership to frontline staff who lacked authority to implement meaningful solutions. Robert Chen added details about specific incidents that illustrated Derek's strategic approach to bullying. He's figured out exactly how to stay within the technical boundaries while creating maximum psychological impact. Yesterday, he spent an entire class period asking Marcus Thompson questions about his family situation, making it sound academic while everyone knew he was just trying to humiliate him about his grandfather's military service. This information provided important context about Derek's targeting methods and confirmed James's assessment that the behavior was calculated rather than impulsive. The reference to Marcus Thompson's family military background also suggested potential connections to themes that might become relevant in James's own interactions with the group. The afternoon classes began with the same careful observation and professional delivery that had characterized James's approach throughout his substitute teaching career. Fourth period proceeded without incident, though he noted the continued presence of Jason Kruger and his persistent surveillance of classroom dynamics. The student's behavior remained within acceptable boundaries, but his obvious cataloging of information suggested preparation for something beyond routine disruption. Fifth period brought the return of Derek Walsh and his core associates, entering the classroom with the confident swagger that marked their assumption of control over social dynamics. James observed their positioning and non-verbal communication, noting the deliberate coordination that suggested planned activity rather than spontaneous interaction. The lesson plan focused on the Battle of Iwo Jima, providing historical context about one of the Pacific Theater's most significant and costly engagements. James began with standard introduction of the topic, using maps and timelines to establish the strategic importance of the island and the challenges faced by American forces in securing it against determined Japanese resistance. Derek allowed the lesson to proceed for several minutes before beginning his intervention, raising his hand with the same exaggerated formality he had used the previous day. "Mr. Rivera, I'm curious about something. My grandfather served in the Pacific, and he always said that the real heroes were the ones who died, not the ones who came back and spent their time talking about it. What's your opinion on that?" The comment was carefully designed to probe James's military background while creating emotional pressure through the implication that anyone who survived combat and discussed it afterward was somehow diminished. Compared to those who made the ultimate sacrifice, it demonstrated Derek's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and his ability to weaponize seemingly patriotic sentiments for personal advantage. James recognized the multiple layers of the attack: the attempt to force disclosure of personal information, the implied questioning of his integrity and courage, and the creation of a public forum where any response could be twisted to support Derek's narrative of substitute teacher inadequacy. His response required careful navigation of these hazards while maintaining educational focus and professional dignity. "Your grandfather's service and sacrifice deserve tremendous respect," James replied calmly, "and you raise an important point about how we honor different types of contribution to difficult missions. The soldiers who fought at Iwo Jima faced extraordinary challenges, and both those who returned and those who didn't played essential roles in achieving strategic objectives. What aspects of their experience do you think are most important for us to understand today?" Once again, Derek's attempt at provocation had been deflected through a response that honored the stated concern, while redirecting conversation toward educational content. His visible frustration suggested that his strategic planning hadn't anticipated this level of composure and skill in verbal maneuvering. Tyler Stone contributed to the escalating pressure through increasingly obvious behavioral disruption, dropping materials, making noise with his chair, and engaging in whispered conversations that pulled focus away from the lesson. His actions were calibrated to stay just within the boundaries of plausible deniability while creating cumulative stress that would eventually force a response from James. or create an environment where other students couldn't learn effectively. Marcus Thompson remained in his uncomfortable position within the group, clearly reluctant to participate in the harassment, but equally reluctant to distance himself in ways that might make him a target. James observed his body language carefully, noting signs of internal conflict that suggested potential willingness to disengage from Derek's activities, if provided with appropriate support and protection. As the class period progressed, Derek's tactics became more direct and personal. He began making comments about substitute teachers who pretended to be something they weren't, and questioning whether someone who couldn't hold a real teaching job was qualified to discuss military history with students whose families had actually served in combat. The attacks were clearly designed to provoke an emotional response that would either reveal vulnerability or create grounds for complaint about unprofessional behavior by a substitute teacher. James maintained his calm demeanor while documenting the progression of harassment in mental notes that would become important if administrative intervention became necessary. "You know what I think, Mr. Rivera," Derek said, standing from his desk with deliberate casualness. "I think people who talk about military service without having earned the right to do so are basically stolen valor cases. What do you think about someone like that teaching military history to impressionable young people?" The accusation was serious enough to cross lines that might finally force administrative response, but it was delivered in questioning format that maintained Derek's plausible deniability while creating maximum reputational damage. James understood that his response to this escalation would determine whether the situation continued to develop along predictable lines or shifted into new territory, requiring different strategies. "Stolen valor is indeed a serious concern," James replied with continued calm, "and it raises important questions about authenticity and credibility in educational contexts. What sources do you think students should use to verify the accuracy of information they receive in academic settings?" Derek's eyes flashed with anger at having his most serious accusation treated as an opportunity for educational discussion rather than personal attack. His frustration with James's refusal to be drawn into defensive responses was becoming obvious to other students, some of whom were beginning to recognize the dynamic at play and question Derek's apparent inability to achieve his usual results. The bell-ending fifth period provided another natural conclusion to the developing confrontation, but Derek's body language as he gathered his materials suggested that the testing phase was concluding and more direct action would follow. James noted the change in demeanor and the meaningful glances exchanged between Derek and his associates as they prepared to leave the classroom. "This isn't over," Tyler Stone muttered as he passed James's desk, making the threat just loud enough to be heard while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid clear grounds for disciplinary action. His comment confirmed that the group had moved beyond testing and was preparing for escalation that would force more definitive responses. As students filed out of the classroom, Marcus Thompson once again lingered near the door with the same expression of internal conflict James had observed the previous day. This time, however, he took a half step toward James's desk before stopping himself and hurrying to catch up with Derek's group in the hallway. James remained at his desk as the classroom emptied, understanding that the events of the past 2 days had established a pattern that was approaching a critical decision point. Derek Walsh's frustration with his inability to provoke desired responses, combined with the public nature of his failed attempts, created conditions where face-saving measures might require escalation beyond verbal confrontation. The sixth period. Class provided another opportunity to observe the dramatic difference in student behavior when Derek's intimidating presence was removed from the classroom environment. Students who had remained silent during fifth period participated actively in discussions, asked thoughtful questions, and demonstrated engagement levels that highlighted the oppressive effect of fear-based social dynamics on educational achievement. After the final bell, James completed his documentation while considering the likely progression of events and appropriate preparation for continued escalation. His military experience had taught him that failed attempts at intimidation often led to more direct confrontation, particularly when the failure occurred in public settings where reputation and social standing were at stake. Principal Donovan appeared in his classroom doorway as he was gathering his materials, her expression suggesting she had received additional reports about Derek's behavior. This time, her approach was more direct, indicating that the situation had progressed beyond the level where administrative avoidance was a viable strategy. Mr. Rivera, I need to ask you directly, have Derek Walsh or his associates made any specific threats or engaged in behavior that you consider threatening or inappropriate? Her question suggested both concern for his welfare and recognition that the situation might be approaching levels requiring more decisive intervention. James considered his response carefully, understanding that his answer would influence the administration's approach to managing the developing conflict. His documentation of Derek's behavior provided clear evidence of harassment and intimidation, but translating that evidence into administrative action would require navigation of the political considerations that had previously prevented effective response. Derek has been testing boundaries consistently since I arrived, James replied factually, using tactics designed to provoke reactions that might justify complaints about my professionalism. His comments today included accusations of stolen valor and implications about my qualifications and integrity. Other students have been affected by the hostile environment his behavior creates. Principal Donovan's expression grew more serious. As she processed this information, particularly the reference to stolen valor accusations, which carried legal implications beyond typical student misconduct, her response would indicate whether the administration was prepared to address the situation decisively or would continue seeking ways to manage it through avoidance and accommodation. I'll need you to document everything in writing, she said. Finally, specific quotes, times, witnesses, everything you can remember. We may need to take more formal action if this behavior continues, and proper documentation will be essential for any disciplinary procedures. James nodded, understanding that this request represented movement toward accountability, though the conditional language suggested continued hesitancy about confronting Derek's family connections directly. He agreed to provide comprehensive documentation while maintaining his professional approach to classroom management and student interaction. As he left the building that afternoon, James reflected on the dynamics he had observed in the likely continuation of Derek's campaign to establish dominance through intimidation. The pattern was approaching a point where more direct confrontation would be necessary, and James understood that his response would need to balance appropriate protection of students with professional responsibilities that limited his options for addressing systemic problems. What he couldn't anticipate was that Derek Walsh's frustration with his failed attempts at verbal intimidation would lead him to target Marcus Thompson in a way specifically designed to force James into a position where intervention would be unavoidable, and that this intervention would reveal capabilities and background information that would transform the entire dynamic at Jefferson High School in ways that none of them could have predicted. The emergency meeting in Principal Donovan's office 3 hours later brought together district officials, school board members, and legal representatives in a conference that would determine James Rivera's future at Jefferson High School. Derek Walsh's father had arrived with the family attorney, demanding immediate dismissal and criminal charges against James for what they characterized as unprovoked assault on students by an unstable former soldier. Superintendent Michael Bradford presided over the meeting with the careful neutrality of someone navigating political landmines while trying to determine facts from competing narratives. The presence of Derek's father, board member Richard Walsh, created obvious conflict of interest that complicated objective evaluation of the incident and its implications for district policy. "Mr. Rivera," Superintendent Bradford began, "we've reviewed witness statements from 14 students, all of whom corroborate your account of events leading to physical intervention. However, the use of military combat techniques in a classroom setting raises serious questions about appropriate response protocols for educational environments." James sat calmly across from the assembled officials, understanding that the meeting's outcome would depend less on facts than on political calculations about liability, publicity, and institutional protection. His decision to reveal military capabilities had resolved the immediate crisis while creating longer-term complications that extended beyond his individual employment. Derek Walsh slouched in his chair beside his father, his earlier arrogance replaced by sullen resentment at being forced to participate in proceedings that highlighted his humiliating defeat. The contrast between his current demeanor and his classroom intimidation tactics was stark enough to influence even sympathetic observers. "What concerns me most," Richard Walsh interjected with barely controlled anger, "is that this district hired someone with obvious PTSD issues to work around children. My son could have been seriously injured by this man's inability to control his violent impulses in civilian settings." The accusation was designed to shift focus from Derek's behavior to James's military background, portraying combat experience as psychological damage that made him unsuitable for educational environments. The strategy reflected calculated attempts to exploit civilian prejudices about veteran mental health while avoiding accountability for Derek's escalating misconduct. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the district's psychological consultant, reviewed James's employment records before responding to Walsh's concerns. Mr. Rivera underwent standard background checks and psychological evaluation before being approved for substitute teaching. His military service record shows multiple commendations for leadership under pressure, with no indication of mental health issues or disciplinary problems. Her clinical assessment undermined Walsh's attempt to portray James as psychologically unstable, while highlighting the professional recognition he had received for exactly the kind of composed leadership he had demonstrated during the classroom crisis. The contrast between his documented service record and Derek's disciplinary history became increasingly relevant to administrative evaluation. "The real issue here," added District Legal Counsel Jennifer Park, "is whether Mr. Rivera's response was proportionate to the threat level and whether his military training enhanced or compromised his ability to manage the situation safely." The witness statements indicate clear escalation by the students and measured response by the substitute teacher. Principal Donovan presented security footage from hallway cameras that captured audio portions of the classroom confrontation, providing additional evidence of Derek's aggressive behavior and James's attempts at de-escalation before physical intervention became necessary. The recorded material supported student witness accounts while undermining Derek's claims of unprovoked attack. "This footage shows my son being brutally assaulted by someone who should never have been placed in a classroom," Walsh protested, though his argument was weakened by clear audio evidence of Derek's threats and initiated physical contact. The district's negligence in hiring this individual has created liability that will require significant legal response. James spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice carrying the calm authority that had impressed students and colleagues throughout his brief tenure at Jefferson High. "Mr. Walsh, Your son threatened another student with physical harm, initiated unwanted contact, and created a hostile environment that prevented other students from learning safely. My response was designed to neutralize those threats while protecting everyone present. The directness of his statement, combined with documented evidence supporting his account, created uncomfortable silence as participants processed the gap between Walsh's narrative and recorded reality. Derek's attempt to appear victimized became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of mounting contradictory evidence. Superintendent Bradford reviewed additional documentation that had emerged during the investigation, including previous incident reports involving Derek that had been minimized or dismissed due to his father's political influence. The pattern of escalating behavior provided context for understanding how the situation had developed to crisis levels. "Mr. Walsh," Bradford addressed Derek directly, "multiple teachers have documented concerning behavior patterns over the past 2 years, including verbal harassment of other students, disruption of educational activities, and intimidation tactics that have affected the learning environment for your classmates. This incident appears to represent escalation of existing problems rather than isolated misconduct." Derek's discomfort with direct questioning became obvious as he struggled to respond to specific allegations supported by documented evidence. His previous confidence in institutional protection was challenged by administrative willingness to address his behavior patterns rather than focusing exclusively on James's military background. These alleged incidents are either fabricated or taken out of context by teachers who have personal grudges against successful students from prominent families. Richard Walsh responded defensively. "My son has never been formally disciplined because there has never been credible evidence of inappropriate behavior." Dr. Mitchell consulted additional records before responding to Walsh's assertion. "Actually, Mr. Walsh, there have been 17 documented incidents involving Derek over the past 18 months, including 3 cases where other students required counseling services due to emotional distress caused by his harassment. The lack of formal discipline reflects administrative reluctance to address behavior patterns rather than absence of credible evidence." The revelation of extensive documentation contradicted Walsh's claims while highlighting institutional failure to address known problems through appropriate intervention. The accumulation of evidence painted a picture of systematic misconduct enabled by political protection rather than isolated incidents being exaggerated by hostile faculty. Furthermore, Principal Donovan added reluctantly, "Yesterday's assault on Marcus Thompson in the parking lot represents the first time Derek's behavior escalated to physical violence. But our investigation shows it was consistent with escalating intimidation tactics that had been reported multiple times without meaningful response." Marcus Thompson's mother, who had been notified of her son's involvement in the incident, spoke from the back of the room where she had been observing quietly. "My son came home with bruises and was too afraid to tell me what happened because Derek threatened worse consequences if he reported anything. This is the first time any adult has protected Marcus from this boy's cruelty." Her testimony provided additional context about the broader impact of Derek's behavior and the climate of fear that had prevented effective reporting of misconduct. The mother's gratitude toward James contrasted sharply with Walsh's demands for his prosecution, highlighting different perspectives on appropriate response to student safety concerns. "Mrs. Thompson," Superintendent Bradford acknowledged, "we are reviewing our policies for addressing harassment and intimidation to ensure better protection for all students. Your son's courage in providing honest testimony about this incident will help inform those policy improvements." Richard Walsh's expression darkened as he recognized that the meeting was not proceeding according to his expectations for administrative support of his son's position. The accumulation of contradictory evidence and witness testimony made his demands for James's prosecution increasingly untenable, while exposing institutional failures that implicated his own role as school board member. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic witch hunt I've come to expect from this administration, Walsh declared angrily. Instead of holding a dangerous individual accountable for assaulting students, you're trying to blame the victims and justify inexcusable behavior by someone who should never have been hired. His escalating rhetoric revealed frustration with losing control over narrative and outcome, but also demonstrated the intimidation tactics that had previously been effective in suppressing accountability for Derek's misconduct. The public setting and recorded proceedings made such tactics less effective while exposing their manipulative nature. District Legal Counsel Park reviewed applicable policies and legal precedents before announcing her preliminary assessment. Based on available evidence, Mr. Rivera's actions appear consistent with appropriate response to imminent threats against student safety. His military training enhanced rather than compromised his ability to resolve the crisis while minimizing harm to all parties involved. The legal conclusion provided institutional cover for supporting James, while establishing precedent for future situations involving substitute teachers with specialized training. Walsh's demands for prosecution were undermined by professional, legal assessment that his son's behavior, rather than James's response, represented the primary policy violation. Additionally, Park continued, the district faces significant liability exposure if we fail to address the documented pattern of harassment and intimidation that created conditions requiring emergency intervention. Effective response to this incident must include comprehensive review of our anti-bullying policies and enforcement mechanisms. The shift toward addressing Derek's behavior rather than prosecuting James represented fundamental change in administrative approach to student misconduct involving influential families. Walsh's political protection for his son was being challenged by legal necessities and documented evidence that could no longer be ignored or minimized. Superintendent Bradford announced his preliminary decision after consulting with legal counsel and reviewing all available documentation. Mr. Rivera will be retained as substitute teacher pending completion of formal investigation, with commendation for his professional response to a crisis situation that protected student safety and resolved potential violence without serious injury. The decision represented vindication for James, while establishing district commitment to supporting effective classroom management even when it required confronting influential families. Derek's expectation of institutional protection was replaced by accountability measures that would restrict his ability to continue intimidating other students. Derek Walsh will be suspended pending comprehensive behavioral evaluation and implementation of intervention strategies designed to address documented harassment patterns. His return to regular classes will be contingent on demonstrated behavioral improvement and completion of required counseling services. Derek's shock at facing actual consequences for his behavior was obvious as he processed the reality that his father's political influence could no longer shield him from accountability. The public nature of his humiliation in James's classroom had made administrative avoidance impossible while exposing institutional failures that required corrective action. Richard Walsh's threats of legal action became increasingly desperate as he recognized that his strategy of intimidating the administration had backfired by drawing attention to his son's extensive misconduct record. This decision will be appealed to the State Board of Education, and civil litigation against this district will proceed regardless of your administrative whitewash. His bluster carried less conviction as legal realities became apparent. The documented evidence of Derek's behavior, combined with multiple witness testimonies and security footage, created strong legal position for the district while exposing Walsh's own liability for enabling harassment through political interference. 3 weeks later, James Rivera received notification that Mrs. Henderson would be extending her family leave indefinitely, creating opportunity for longer-term substitute assignment at Jefferson High School. His effectiveness in managing challenging classroom dynamics had impressed both administration and faculty, leading to additional assignment offers throughout the district. Derek Walsh's return to school after counseling and behavioral intervention was marked by significantly reduced influence over student social dynamics. His public defeat and administrative accountability had eliminated the fear-based hierarchy that had enabled his misconduct while encouraging other students to report harassment rather than enduring it silently. Marcus Thompson's transformation was particularly dramatic, evolving from terrorized victim to confident student who participated actively in class discussions and formed positive relationships with peers who no longer feared association with Derek's targets. His mother's advocacy for improved anti-bullying policies had contributed to district-wide reforms that better protected vulnerable students. The broader impact of James's intervention extended beyond individual student outcomes to influence institutional culture and administrative approaches to discipline enforcement. His demonstration that effective response to bullying was possible had encouraged other teachers to address misconduct more directly, while providing students with hope that adult protection was available when needed. Principal Donovan's evaluation of the incident emphasized the importance of supporting substitute teachers who demonstrated exceptional competence in crisis management rather than avoiding challenging situations through accommodation of dysfunctional behavior. The district's policy changes reflected lessons learned about the cost of administrative avoidance when dealing with systematic misconduct. On a quiet Friday afternoon 6 months later, James stood in his permanently assigned classroom at Jefferson High School, reviewing lesson plans for Monday's American history classes. His military background was no longer concealed, but integrated into his teaching approach, providing students with authentic perspectives on historical events while demonstrating how specialized training could be applied effectively in civilian contexts. The transformation of Jefferson High's social environment was reflected in increased student participation, reduced disciplinary incidents, and improved academic achievement across multiple measures. Parents who had previously considered transferring their children were now recommending the school to other families, citing the administration's commitment to student safety and effective teaching standards. Derek Walsh had transferred to a private military academy where his behavioral issues would be addressed through structured discipline and accountability measures that his previous environment had failed to provide. His departure eliminated the toxic social dynamics that had dominated student interaction, while allowing genuine academic culture to flourish. Marcus Thompson stopped by James's classroom during lunch, carrying college preparation materials and wearing the confident demeanor of someone who had overcome significant challenges through perseverance and appropriate adult support. His academic achievements in the months following Derek's departure demonstrated the potential that had been suppressed by fear and intimidation. "Mr. Rivera," Marcus said with genuine gratitude, "I wanted to thank you again for standing up for me when no one else would. My guidance counselor says I'm on track for early admission to several universities with strong engineering programs." James smiled with quiet satisfaction, understanding that his decision to reveal military capabilities had protected more than individual students from immediate harm. The intervention had challenged institutional dysfunction while demonstrating that adult leadership could effectively address bullying when courage and competence were combined with commitment to student welfare. "You earned those opportunities through your own hard work and determination, Marcus," James replied. "I'm proud of how you've grown into your potential once the barriers were removed." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other students seeking help with historical research projects, their comfortable interaction with James reflecting the trust and respect that effective teaching created when combined with genuine concern for student development. The classroom had become a safe space where learning could flourish without fear of harassment or intimidation. As the school day concluded, James reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from concealed substitute teacher to respected permanent faculty member whose military background enhanced, rather than hindered, his educational effectiveness. His experience at Jefferson High had proven that specialized training and civilian teaching responsibilities could be integrated successfully when applied with appropriate judgment and institutional support. The transformation of Derek Walsh, from untouchable bully to accountable student, had demonstrated that institutional change was possible when leadership chose courage over convenience. The broader reforms implemented following the incident had created lasting improvements in school culture that would benefit future students while establishing precedents for addressing similar situations effectively. Walking to his car in the faculty parking lot, James encountered Principal Donovan reviewing security reports that showed continued reduction in disciplinary incidents and improvement in student satisfaction surveys. Her expression reflected satisfaction with outcomes that had exceeded expectations, while validating difficult decisions made during crisis management. "James," she said warmly, "I wanted to let you know that the district is planning to use our experience here as a model for other schools dealing with similar challenges. Your approach to classroom management and crisis intervention has influenced policy development at the state level." The recognition represented broader validation of principles James had learned through military service and applied successfully in civilian educational contexts. His demonstration that former combat personnel could contribute effectively to student development had challenged stereotypes while providing practical solutions to persistent institutional problems. 6 months after Derek Walsh's public humiliation in room 204, Jefferson High School had become a model for effective anti-bullying intervention and supportive educational environment where students could achieve their academic potential without fear of harassment or intimidation. The quiet substitute teacher who had protected Marcus Thompson had become a permanent fixture whose influence extended far beyond individual classroom management to transform institutional culture and student outcomes. The Marine who had once served his country in combat zones overseas had found new purpose in protecting vulnerable students from domestic threats that could be just as devastating to young lives as any foreign enemy. His greatest victory hadn't been achieved through superior firepower or tactical advantage, but through moral courage and professional competence applied at the moment when protection was needed most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.